Early morning hours of December the 6th, 2004. Just after 4 a.m., a man ran inside of the 7-Eleven screaming, out of breath and covered in blood. And this man that ran into the 7-Eleven was Jason Amami.
Knox County 911.
There's a man that just walked in the store. He's heavily bloodied. Looks like he's been in a fight. His roommate's still in there. Apparently somebody broke into his house.
Is his roommate okay?
He doesn't know.
Immediately, authorities were dispatched to the scene, and by 4:30 a.m., first responders had arrived to the apartment building. Once they were able to kind of gather themselves and get inside of the building, they were confronted with the most horrific and shocking scene. 21-year-old Jonna Berry was found mostly unresponsive, covered in blood, suffering from several stab wounds on the ground at the bottom of the stairs of the apartment buildings. The apartment was covered in blood, most of it coming from Jonna's room. Jonna had been stabbed 20 plus times all over her face and her upper body. 5 a.m., her parents received a phone call that changed their lives forever. Mike and Joan were told that Jonna, their daughter, had potentially been a stabbing victim that had succumbed to her injuries. Authorities started at the scene of the crime. They wanted to gather as much forensic evidence as possible and details to see if this led them in any sort of direction. The living room of Jonna and Jason's apartment was a bent and knife found in the middle of the floor. Upon further searches, it appeared that this knife also came from within the apartment. On top of that, there was an entire trail of blood leading out to the back door. One of the very first ones they decided to look at was her fiance, Jason White. Jason White's phone records were pulled, and they were able to confirm that he had been in Michigan the night of the attack. And this led them to the next obvious person to look into and rule out, just from a standpoint of looking into everyone close to the crime. And that was Jason Amami. He believed that Jonna was just having a nightmare. It did not cross his mind that someone could potentially be in their apartment. He said that he remembered looking over at the clock and saw 4 a.m. and then he got up to go and check on Jonna and make sure she was all right. And when he opened his door, he was immediately met with an intruder. And as soon as this intruder met eyes with Jason, he immediately began to attack. Jason said that he fought relentlessly, at one point even grabbing the knife with his bare hand. At this point, Jason helped authorities create a sketch of the attacker. He was able to give a very, very good description. Authorities looked at him as their very first suspect. From what they were gathering, the only person with access to the apartment would have been Jason or Jonna. The alleged murder weapon was also from the apartment itself. They also claimed that Jason's story had changed. Jason is clearly heard saying that as he left the apartment, Jonna had been screaming. But in his subsequent interview, when he was released from the hospital and authorities were able to speak to him, at this point he claimed that he wasn't sure if Jonna was screaming or not. So on December 9th, he was brought back in by authorities. Now, this time, they wanted Jason to go back to the scene of the crime where he was attacked and Jonna was killed, and according to them, he lacked pretty much all emotion. Even as he laid in his own bed that he had been attacked in and reenacted this attack with an officer standing over him and holding him, he showed no response. But at this point, police had their hands tied. They had recovered plenty of forensic evidence throughout the entire scene of the crime. It had all been sent off for forensic testing. As it rolled into the following year of 2005, they ended up asking Jason to come in for a polygraph, and he willingly agreed. Now, Jason was asked a handful of questions during this examination by the examiner, and as the test came to a close, instead of the examiner informing the detectives of the results, which is typically how it goes, the examiner instead looked Jason dead in the eye and straight up accused him of killing Jonna. And so this was just totally out of pocket. And obviously authorities saw this and thought the same because they immediately shut this down. They decided to just have another examiner look at the test results from the first test. And interestingly, this examiner said there was nothing on there that made them feel he was being deceptive. He had passed the polygraph. But again, despite all of this, authorities still zeroed in on Jason. They were not going to let this go. When the DNA test came back, it was found, obviously, that Jonna's blood was on the murder weapon, along with other evidence taken. There was also Jason A. Mummy's blood, which would make sense since he had been repeatedly stabbed with that same knife. But there was a third DNA profile. So Jason had absolutely nothing to do with the crime. They were sending in DNA samples and comparison samples from everyone possible. 3 years after Jonna's murder and the weekend of her parents' anniversary, they were spending time together and they got another unexpected phone call. So sometime in early 2007, a call had come in from a concerned citizen who it appears lived in the area and just so happened to pass by a local billboard. And in all these 3 years, despite, I believe, again, living in the area, they had not seen any of the posters or the billboards or the box trucks or anything that was out there for Jonna, any of the news coverage. And as they're looking at this billboard, they notice the sketch of the alleged perpetrator. And right away, they're like, I recognize that person. And so they called into authorities and said, hey, that person on the sketch, that person on your billboard is 22-year-old Taylor Lee Olson. He currently had an outstanding warrant due to a probation violation. And so he was arrested and brought in, and while incarcerated for this unrelated offense, they took advantage of the situation to question him about Jonna's murder. Olson right away denied any involvement. Once they obtained Olson's DNA, they quickly sent it off to be compared to the DNA sample that was found at the scene of the crime. The DNA from Taylor Olson and the unidentified male at the murder scene were a match. Taylor Olson had to be their guy. They ended up getting the green light to proceed with charges. And so on September 24th, 2007, Taylor Olson was arrested in a mall parking lot and brought in to be specifically, this time, questioned about the attack on Jason and the murder of Jonna Berry. Olson was questioned a handful of times over the next couple of days, each time becoming more and more distressed and remaining very adamant that he was not involved. But eventually, he ended up cracking and he confessed. Olson told detectives that he was living in an apartment down the street with a friend of his named Noah Cox. And he said that they decided that their entertainment for that night, December 5th into December 6th, was to break into cars, get high, guzzle some stolen beer. That was their idea of a good night. And he claimed that he and his friend Noah split up, and he believed that Noah had gone home. But Taylor Olson was not ready to end the night yet. He told detectives that he wanted to steal a car. And so his plans were to go around and check nearby apartments to see if they were unlocked so that he could hopefully find a set of keys, set off a car alarm, quickly locate the car, hop in, and take it home. This is when he stumbled across the unlocked back door of Jonna and Jason's apartment. Essentially, it seems like he was claiming that Jonna must have kept a knife in her room, and when she heard him in the house, she came out to defend herself and try to get him to leave. And he's claiming that it was dark, he couldn't see what was going on, and he just got into a struggle with someone, and he doesn't remember stabbing anyone, but he does remember that he was stabbed and that he ran out of the apartment as fast as he possibly could. He was ultimately charged with first-degree murder, attempted first-degree murder, felony murder, and aggravated burglary, and he was held on $1 million bond. The moment he walked out, he said, quote, "I'm sorry, I never meant for this to happen. It was an accident." Again, kind of leaning into this idea that he had no idea what had happened and that he was just told he did it, and so he was accepting it. Just after being thrown in jail, honestly, to no surprise, Olson ended up recanting his confession. He seemed to not just recant his confession, but he pointed the finger at someone else. He said that he knew there was another person responsible. On March 24th, 2008, just months before his trial was set to begin, Taylor Olson was found dead in his cell. He had ended his own life. A 9-page handwritten letter had been found in Taylor's cell. This letter is titled The Story. In this letter, Taylor claims that he did not break into the apartment by himself. While initially they were not releasing the name of this person, eventually it was released, and it was Noah Cox. He was the one who killed her. It said in the letter, quote, "Noah heard the rumble and ran in to help me. I ran out the back and just ran. He killed that girl." Authorities had actually questioned Noah in connection to the murder before they even knew about Taylor Olson. Noah had a long criminal history. Again, he lived relatively close, and when authorities spoke to him, he stated that he was actually passed out drunk in his apartment at the time of the murders. Now that all of this was brought up again, prosecutors and detectives were like, okay, we'd already questioned this guy, now he's being brought up again. We have evidence that the person he was with that night was in the apartment. Was he maybe there too? There was not just one hat taken, there were 2 hats. Only one hat was found on Jana's bed, and they had already believed that this hat had come off during the attack. Only DNA found on the hat was from the original owner. With that, the case was closed.